whether it's experiences, advice that can help solve problems or improve the lives or businesses of those who are listening. A lot of times I'll get people who will say, oh, you should have so-and-so on your podcast. And I say, tell me about them so then I know how they can serve my audience.
Most hosts never achieve the results they hoped for. They're falling short on listenership and monetization, meaning their message isn't being heard and their show ends up costing them money. This podcast was created to help you grow your listenership and make money while you're at it. Get ready to take notes. Here's your host, Adam Adams.
Hey, podcaster, if you want to be a better show host, which means two things, really. How to ask better questions is going to make you a better host, especially if you're interviewing other people or if you're having your own content. You got to ask yourself, what am I going to do to get the best content today? Additionally, you might be thinking, hey, how do I monetize? I don't want this show to be costing me money. It's always taking money out of my pocket. How do I get it to put money back into my pocket? Well, I've got Shaye Koester-Wanner on the podcast today. She hosts a show with a lovely logo. It's called Casual Cattle Conversations, and the logo is a mic with cow ears. Amazing. And she did just those two things that we're talking about. So we talked about her monetizing. She did that within 6 months of launching her show. Now she's been downloaded more than 250,000 times just at the time that we're recording this. Helped 11,000 people. And I think it was like, Shaye, you might have to correct me. Did you help 60 different cattle ranchers make more money, be more profitable as well?
Yeah, I have a mastermind program, which we can get into. That's another method of monetization. But yeah, I've had over 60 ranchers flow through there.
So for the listener, I want to share with them two main things. The first is how to monetize their show in 6 months or less. And the second would be, how do we get into asking better questions? So let's jump into, I'll say to the listener real fast, your website, your social media, your podcast, anything that you wanted to share with the listener is already in the show notes. So they can scroll down, connect with you, get your bio there. And with that said, let's jump into this. Give me the formula, give the listener the formula to monetize within 6 months.
So first and foremost is starting before you're ready. So when we think about monetization, one of the biggest challenges that podcasters face is they really get hung up on, well, I'm not in the top 2%. I'm not in the top 1%. I don't have the same amount of listeners as like a Joe Rogan, right? But the reality is the value in your show comes from engaged listeners, repeat listeners, and niching down. So don't focus so much on how many downloads you have. Focus on if you are having the same listeners come back, even if you have small downloads, are they consistent or slightly growing? Is your content serving the same audience? Because if you know who you're talking to, who is listening to your show, and that your consumption rate is good, you're at that, 70% or better. So that's about industry average from what I've been doing research on. Correct me if you know a different number, but start there and know the value of your show, even if that's just a small amount, because there are so many different ways to monetize in that. So once you know kind of the value of your show as far as who's listening, I specialize in host-read ads. Then you can look for companies or other businesses who have a similar target audience as you. Who else is serving the same amount of people? So once you find that, then you can start out with that outreach. You can send a media kit. In my case, I went to a lot of cattle industry trade shows and started casually throwing it out there when I was talking to people, because I'm a rancher myself and my podcast is about ranching. So I'd say, oh, well, this will be valuable on my ranch, but actually, I have this podcast. So having those conversations and going back to that original point about starting before you're ready, I just think, one of my favorite quotes by Lemony Snicket is, if we wait until we're ready, we'll be waiting for the rest of our lives. And sometimes that can be frustrating when people are saying just start, but it's just the simple reality. You got to get over yourself and whatever excuses you're making and start going for it. I've had way more no's than I had yeses, but I still make money.
Yeah. Would you just say that one more time? Just say that sentence one more time.
I've had way more no's than I've had more no's than yeses, but I'm still making money.
So you start before you believe you're ready. You look at that 70% or better consumption rate. You don't think to yourself, like when I go to Facebook groups of podcast hosts and people say, hey, I want to monetize. And they kind of get bombarded. Tell me if you've ever seen this, Shaye. They kind of get bombarded with negative feedback coming from especially the bigger names, but certainly the names that are just getting started too, where they say, don't even think about that until you have 30,000 downloads per episode or whatever. And I don't know if that's their real voice because, you're reading it. And so that's just how I read it when they say it. But yeah, it's like, don't be thinking that I have to have some minimum. I have to have some amount. You got started a little bit earlier than that. Where were you in terms of numbers when you decided I'm going to ask people if they could do a whole spread ad with me?
Gosh, so this is almost 5 years ago when I did that. And I started in college. So I was still early in my college and I was at a trade show and I don't even know if I was at maybe within like a month, my episodes were hitting 100 downloads.
Okay.
So it was still on the lower end comparatively to some people. But I also thought about it. So my audience is cattle producers. And I've niched down within that too, to more progressive cattle producers. Well, if you think about it, people working in production agriculture only make up 2% of the population. So that's really niche down in itself, and you continue to niche down. Why would I expect my show to have the same amount of downloads as someone else who maybe has a broader audience or a broader niche? And I guess I was determined to make money off my podcast partially because people told me I never could, but I knew it was possible. And so I figured, why not?
I'm writing this down. I love this. I was determined. I knew it was possible. Why not? And I think the listener should be saying that as well. I was determined. I knew it was possible. Why not? So you have to figure out who's listening, you said. That was kind of one of that precursors, prereqs. And every podcast out there has a different audience, a different niche or a different broad audience. They might be men, they might be women, they might be both. They might be, trans or any other thing, it could be anything. And how do we know, like, if we've got a podcast, I've got a podcast, John, who's listening, has a podcast, Sarah, who's listening, has a podcast, Bob, who's listening, has a podcast, but none of us share an ideal avatar completely. So what does John and Sarah and Bob need to do to figure out who's listening so that they can know how they're going to monetize?
So what I tell my podcast coaching clients is, in business, we'll say people vote with their pocketbook. With podcasting, people vote with their time. So look at your episodes and look for patterns in download and consumption rate between how long people are listening. Maybe it was a good episode, but maybe they're listening on their commute to work and their commute's only 20 minutes. So if you have a 30 or 40 minute episode, they're just going to drop off and forget to come back. Look at topics. Which topics are performing well consistently? And that'll give you some insight into how people want to spend their time consuming information and what some of those key problems are. And you can kind of marry those two together with topics and consumption rate. I used to say, 20 to 30 minutes was the best length of podcast for my listener, but I've also had some podcasts closer to an hour, but the topic was so engaging that didn't matter for consumption rates. So really look at those patterns. And additionally, you're going to have a few people, with social media, or if you have a mailing list, which I really encourage people to start developing, you're going to have some people reach out to you. You might have to put that as your call to action at the end to encourage that. And that'll give you a little bit of insight too. And when they do reach out to you, ask questions about, hey, why do you listen? What value did you get? Tell me, in my case, it's tell me about your farm or ranch. And that gives me a little insight as to the listener themselves and their own business or their lifestyle. So it's really looking for patterns would be the biggest thing.
Loving it. I'm just making notes at the same time, but I've got a great question, or at least something that I think that the listener would want to know as well. So for you, you mentioned a little bit earlier, you said, hey, I also have a mastermind. And I think then you followed it with, that's one of the ways that I monetize my show. And with that said, I'd like to hear what ways that you monetize your show. And it sounds like host-read ads are one of them, because you go to trade shows and you meet people and you pitch and you hear more no's than yeses, but you still make money. And it sounds like there's a mastermind component. Could you outline, maybe the top 2 or 3 places that you make money through your podcast? And then we can go a little bit deeper on figuring out how would the listener utilize that avenue for them.
Yeah. So you hit it when you said host read ads and the mastermind. And so host read ads, that's where I started. And a lot of it was trade show stuff. And actually now it's moving more towards a lot of emails too, some cold outreach there too. But host read ads is that's where most of my income comes from on the podcast side of things. Additionally, early in my podcast journey, I tried the patron method because I host through Podbean. So they had that set up for me. And I had 3 or 4 people. And, early on, it did help me kind of break even. But man, I was tired of just breaking even. And so I kept thinking, how do I continue to add more value? What's going to be the most impactful? And so I ended up discontinuing the patron and starting this mastermind program, which I called Rancher Minds as a play on word. And so with that, my members pay for a monthly subscription, and we have monthly Q&A calls plus a bonus call each quarter. Sometimes I bring in a few extra speakers, but they're basically more intense conversations. And my members have the ability to ask the questions and really bring out those topics that matter most to them. And which, when you think about it, is very similar to what a patron program could look like. But for me, it was most beneficial to call it more of a mastermind, rebrand, and add value in a different way than what I was doing before. So host read ads and the mastermind.
Let's go into, so Patreon is something that a few of our guests have talked about. Some liked it, some didn't like it. Most of them tried it for a while and then switched gears. So along the same line with you.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had some clients that worked with our company that we helped to be able to monetize their show. And one of the biggest ways that we mention is if you have your own product or service. And one of our clients came on, he did an interview and he mentioned that he makes about $500,000 a year just with his mastermind that he sells specifically just through the podcast. So he's crushing it. Like, he's doing really well. It's definitely paying for itself. And I think that the listener might be trying to understand and know like how to navigate some of these things. So if I am Sarah and I'm listening right now and I have a different podcast, it's not about ranching, it's not about podcasting, it's about something else. How would I go about making money through host-read ads? Who might I call? How might I reach out to them? What might I say? How much should I possibly ask for? What's too low? Do you mind kind of going into that for our listener, Sarah, today?
Yeah. And so I'm going to kind of start at the end of that where you brought up the pricing. How much do you ask? What's too low? And this is a hurdle that I really had to overcome with my own business journey. Is I used to be the person with really low prices. And actually, once I raised my prices, I ended up getting more sales because it's not that people wanted a deal. Part of it is when people see a price, they associate it with value, if that makes sense. So like if you're selling an ad for $10 versus $100, people aren't going to associate a $10 ad as being valuable. So why would they even put their money there?
Yeah. I love it.
So
can I pick
that really has
just
to,
because I have a recent experience like that. So a long, long time ago, I was a handyman. I started managing properties, my own and other people's, and I figured out how to do a lot of the work in houses, plumbing and electrical and stuff like that. And I have a buddy who does fix and flips, and he knows me from that realm, and we've done like 50 invoices for the same guy. Actually more than 50, but barely over. And we're finishing up one of his projects that was in a condominium, and a woman, older, mostly retired, just works a couple days a week to do whatever. She's like, "Hey, I've been seeing you do good work down here. Come upstairs. Let's look in. Maybe you could do something here." And I remember I gave her a high price, like a fairly high price, because, if I'm going to do it, I want to do it well, and I want to make money, and I want it to be fair, but I gave her something that was not low. And so we ended up bidding her out for $5,000 and some odd dollars to do a few things: painting, some plumbing, some electrical. Not a huge thing, but around $5,500. And she told her friend on the phone while I was in earshot, she was like, "Oh yeah, they're doing all this stuff, and this is how much it's costing." And the person on the phone said to her, "Oh, you could have had my buddy do it for $200. And she's like, "No, I want this to be done right." Mm-hmm. And so partly it could have been because she saw some of our work in a different unit, but she wanted to pay the higher price. She deserved to pay the higher price because she wanted to have a good job done. And we are making it really, really good. And I think that goes along with what you're saying, Shaye, which is, in a way, there's a perceived amount of value on how you charge. And if you're charging like $5 per episode, sure, you could get lots of people, but they might not believe that they're getting a lot of value. But if you're charging, for example, $5,000 per episode, they'll be like, "Man, this must be a great podcast. This is getting in front of like the right person." So anyway, I wanted to piggyback on that because I had an experience in a different field, not podcasting, that I thought was interesting to bring up. So how do you know if it's too low? I cut you off and I want you to finish.
Well, and you have to do what feels right to you internally as well. Growing up, my parents always told me to trust my gut. That's something I've always done. And sometimes for me, it's trusting my gut and actually saying, okay, we're going to raise that just a little bit because I know I have a natural tendency to go below that. So, but with that, but then don't just look at the downloads, right? We talked earlier, like downloads, consumption rate, and you brought up in your story, doing a good job. Well, do a good job for your advertisers. And that might not just look like a podcast ad. That might look like a newsletter ad, a social media shout out. How else can you add value to your partners? Can you put them on your website if you have traffic there? Look at all the places you have an audience and figure out ways to give them the most exposure possible, because a package is typically more enticing than just a single mid-roll or pre-roll. So I hope that explains a little bit about kind of pricing and some structure there. I encourage people to create a media kit. If you're not graphically inclined, it's not that expensive to hire someone, or there's this great free resource called Canva that you can use as well. Or even my first one wasn't super fancy, but I just made it on Word too. So you could just have a media kit that outlines what value they are getting in exchange for that dollar amount. And
is
just
there anything that's really
people.
important on your media kit? Like, is there anything that pretty much any podcaster is going to need to add to that's going to help them get that paying sponsor?
So the biggest thing is going to be who you're talking to, right? Because if your target audience isn't in alignment, it's not worth it for both of you. I've turned advertisers down because our audiences weren't in alignment, because my listeners don't want to hear an ad that's not going to serve them. And advertisers don't want to pay to talk to an audience that doesn't want to buy from them.
Yeah.
So it's not worth it on either end.
Love it.
So go back to that listener. And if you go, there's different platforms that provide podcast statistics, but, you can go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify for podcasters. If you log into your account there, they'll give you accurate statistics on the age and demographics and stuff like that. So you can showcase who your listener is. And in my industry, age and location has been a key factor for my advertisers. Additionally, then you can, consumption rate. We've talked about that already. That's an important one to put on there.
Consumption rate. I'm a listener now, and I'm just hearing consumption rate for the very first time. Where do I go to know what my consumption rate is?
So first, I always say check your hosting provider. And if your hosting provider doesn't offer consumption rate, if you have your show on Apple Podcasts, Apple gives you a consumption rate for every single episode. And you just have to log into
Apple.
It's Apple Podcast Connect.
Okay.
I think that's the website.
We'll find it. We'll have the link down in the show notes for the listener right now. So awesome.
Yeah.
So about the amount of money, you said trust your gut, but give us some number as an idea. Should we be talking around $10 an episode, around $100 an episode, around $1,000 an episode, around $10,000 an episode? What's kind of like a low to high range for an average podcast?
I think that depends on your industry and your advertisers. Think about the return on investment for your advertiser. Are they advertising a $50 product, a $500 product, a $5,000 product? And then you can kind of marry that with how many listeners you have. Right or wrong, when I first started, I said $1 a download for the first. So like if I was getting 100 listens or downloads within a month, I think I figured like $1 a download, just because that's how I justified that in my mind. Right or wrong, I don't know. That's just what made sense to me at that point. I think that's a starting place for some people. But since then, I've really looked more at my total audience size with my newsletter, the podcast, social media, etc., and creating a whole package opportunity for my advertisers. And then from there, I've been able to adjust accordingly as I grow as well.
Yeah. So on the high end, what should somebody who's above average expect to make after 6 months being a podcaster on the high end? What's possible?
It depends on how consistent you are with selling your ads. I mean, you can easily make anywhere from, gosh, that's so hard because everyone's podcast is different. I mean, if you're in your first year podcasting, I always tell people sky's the limit, but you can be making thousands of dollars if you really want to.
Okay. Thousands.
But you have to look at your audience too. Like where I started, I didn't have a social media following yet. I didn't have a business. The podcast came and the business came afterwards. Right now, a lot of people, like you mentioned, people are using their podcast to promote the rest of their business, and that's how they're making sales. In a sense, your podcast is already monetized for you then. But if you already have an audience, if you were already a social media influencer and then you start a podcast, you can funnel people in. So the rate at which you grow is part of it.
How do you do your mastermind? Price wise or thought pattern? Like how is the mastermind that you have as a subscription per month? How does that work? And if the listener could copy it, what would that might look like?
So I used to do it where people could just buy in a call at a time. And that got to be a lot of work for myself and almost hassle for people who wanted to just pay for the full year at a time. So that's why I switched to a subscription model, but so that people just buy in and they're in it for a year and it just automatically renews.
So let me interrupt just to verify what I'm hearing and what the listener might be hearing. If I join your mastermind, it's a subscription and the minimum amount of time that I'm expected to pay per month is 12 months?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
I mean, you can cancel at any time, but
okay, but
you have to have someone do that.
Okay, perfect. And how much do people pay each month to be one of the members?
In my case, it's $50 a month because it's one call a month. Occasionally, a few extra resources sprinkled in there. Right now I'm working on, how do I create the higher ticket offer after that? Because that's just kind of an entry level from getting the free podcast materials into the $50 a month subscription. So that's kind of business wise where I'm going is what value can I add next that's above that? But yeah, it's $50 a month for a monthly mastermind plus quarterly goal setting and community calls. And I bring different experts on to each call. That's kind of the big selling point is that my members tell me what questions they have, what topics they want to learn more about, but then I do the work for them to figure out who they need to talk to.
I like that a lot. So with this, you said something a couple of times, which I absolutely want the listener to take away. The first time that you used the word value that I recall was when we're talking about your partners, and you used the word partners, and that's your sponsor. That's the person who pays to get more exposure through your package, not just a mid-roll ad, but the packages, through everything that you're doing. And you said, how else can you add value to your partners? I just love the way that was phrased, and it really shows where the focus is. The focus isn't on, how much money can I make? The focus is on how much value can I give to these people? And then you did it again a moment ago where you're talking about right now we're doing the mastermind with the Rancher Minds, I think it's called. You're doing that as a monthly subscription. It's $50 a month, very affordable for most people. And you're thinking instead of like, how else can I charge more? You don't word it that way. It doesn't seem like you think of it that way. You think of it like, what value can I add next? What is that thing that I could put together that would be valuable enough that I could help them, my audience with that certain thing.
What are they going to feel good paying for? What are they going to be excited to buy?
Yeah.
It's not about me taking money. As a business owner, I don't think it's selfish to want to make money at all. But it does need to be about providing value. You do need to be solving a problem.
I like that. Perfect. And I also want to talk about asking good questions. So let's move the conversation to questions and interviewing people. Your podcast is called Casual Cattle Conversations. And how do we have our listener, who is a podcaster also, asking better questions on their podcast so that they can help their people grow? We'll be right back.
Hey, my friend, as you know, this episode is sponsored by my company, growyourshow.com. We want you to be able to have the best tools at your disposal without costing you a whole arm and a leg. So right now you can get a free list of vetted equipment that like mics, mixers, webcams, sound treatment, editing software, everything that you need. I created the whole PDF with direct purchase links just to save you time and money, to help it be more convenient for you. So this free PDF will help you skip all the guesswork. If it's on there, it's vetted and approved by yours truly. And if it's not on there, it's probably not worth the money. So go ahead and get yours at growyourshow.com/PDF. Let's get back into the show.
We're back with Shaye Koester-Wanner from Casual Cattle Conversations, and we've talked about monetizing already. And as we get into this portion of the episode, I want to talk more about how are you going to ask better questions? How are you going to grab the attention of your listener? How are you going to add value to your listener? And maybe even highlight the right things from your guest. And so, Shaye, take it away. How do we ask better questions?
So it starts with the basic part of any content creation platform that sometimes we like to overlook. And that is, who is that ideal avatar, that listener? Who do you really want to serve? Because if you dive into who that person is, what challenges they're facing on a day-to-day level, what keeps them up at night, how do you fit into their life as a solution, whether that's bringing experts on about, is it finances? Is it health? Do they just need a good laugh some days? Are you an entertainer? Whatever that may be, you need to understand who that person is. And then from there, when you look at your guests, what part of that guest story is going to help that listener. How do you marry the two together? Because there are so many ways. Adam, you and I could even be taking this conversation today. We could be talking about it so many different ways, but this is how you want to serve your audience. So this is why we're talking about monetizing and asking good questions. And I think, so that's really just where you have to start, is who are you talking to? And what does your guest have, whether it's experiences, advice, that can help solve problems or improve the lives or businesses of those who are listening? A lot of times I'll get people who will say, oh, you should have so-and-so on your podcast. And I say, oh, thanks. That's great. Why? What should I talk to them about? Tell me about them so then I know how they can serve my audience. Because maybe they aren't going to be able to serve my audience now, but maybe they will be able to in a few years. And then after that, when I go through and make a list for a podcast, like when I'm about to reach out to a guest and say, I want you on my show to talk about this, I write my goal for the episode at the very top of the email or the page and say, here's how I want to serve this audience. And then I'll come up with a few questions below that. And usually those immediate questions are not the ones that I stick with. After each question, I ask myself, why? Once, twice, maybe 3 more times to really get down to a more specific question. And that just helps me really stay in alignment with the goal and serve my audience. And that's really what's helped me with asking better questions. And I guess some final advice for asking questions before, if you have any follow-up questions, would be, if you're having a guest on, go listen before you ask them to be on, before you send them questions. Go listen to other podcasts they've been on. Go read other newspaper articles or highlights that they've been featured on, and figure out how you can ask them questions that they haven't been asked before. Share a different side of their story if they're a very well-known person, because that's also going to make that podcast a lot more interesting if people feel like and understand that they're going to learn more from that person.
Yeah. I've had a guest on the show that interviewed a lot of high-named celebrities in their, at least in their niche, which could be small, like ranchers, 2% of the population. But everybody knows who Shaye is because she's the one with the podcast, for example. So in that space, we could go and research you and listen to this episode and some others that you've been on and be like, okay, what's that new thing? Or what did she kind of say that Adam didn't ask more about, for example, that we could go more into? A lot of good things. So I basically have four pieces to asking better questions. And the first one, I agree with all of it, Shaye. The first one is one that I say all the time to my listener, though. It's, you have to understand who that avatar is. That is always step one. Step one is knowing who that person is. You mentioned, what keeps them up at night? What do they want? What do they need? What are they looking for? What do they want to get out of this? What's going to help them? The second piece that I wrote down that you said was, what part of my guest's story, my guest's experience is going to help the listener, my avatar? The third one was really interesting that I got from you. And it happens with me too, but I think you probably do it better. And that is that you have, your goal for the episode, and you might even have a couple of questions lined up or prepared. I think I'll probably ask about this. And then you go deeper. And I like to think of it like there's a couple ways. There's a shotgun approach, which is, it goes all over the place, right? A shotgun explodes and it has little BBs that go left and right and straight and kind of up and kind of down, and it'll practically hit almost anything in the path. But it might not, if you're far away from it, it might not really do a lot of damage to you if you're far, right? But you'll make some damage. And then there's like a sniper rifle, for example, that is kind of like a laser beam just going to an exact place with all of its power in one place. Now, if you miss for good. You have to take another shot. But if you hit your target with that sniper rifle, they're gone. They're definitely gone. And I think of it as like you could dig deep with somebody or you can stay shallow. Now, if you stay on the surface level, an inch deep and a mile wide like a shotgun, you'll just ask question after question that are prepared and you'll never get context behind the question. But if you dig deep and go behind that why behind the why, then you're able to really understand the depth behind what they're doing. And I ran a mastermind for a couple of years in real estate investing. And I remember we did the 6 levels of why. I love that you were like, I'm going to ask why a few times. We did it where we said, hey, why are you investing in real estate? Or why are you doing cattle? Or why are you doing a mastermind? And the person will answer. That first answer seems to be on the surface. The first answer is like, I'm just going to barely kind of answer this. And then you say, well, why do you want that? Why is that important? And they'll go a little bit deeper. And sometimes they'll start to get some emotion behind it. And now you're feeling good. And then you go another level. Why? Why that? Why is it important that your kids go to college? Oh, well, it's because of this and this and this. Okay, well, why is that important to you? Oh, it's because I felt like a failure because I didn't go and I never want that for them. And I start bawling because, I've gotten to the depth of the conversation, not the surface level. And that's something that you are doing. You have the goal, you have a list of questions, but you don't always go to all of the questions because you spend some time going deeper into the pieces where you could sense that there's a little bit more. And so having a takeaway for the listener, understanding to ask why a few more times, not like why, but hey, how did you do that? Or what made you do that? But in different ways can really get a lot of value. I love that. And then number 4, you said that you research the guest, you listen to some of their other podcast interviews, you read some of their articles to allow you to know what they've been asked before, and you might be able to throw them a curveball, something new, something special, something that maybe the listener had never heard before, but you're curious about. So you have a unique episode. Anything else you want to share with the listener, whether it's on anything podcasting, including the 2 things that we've already discussed on this episode? Anything else you want to leave with the listener?
We've talked a lot about a few things, I guess. So we've covered a lot of ground today, Adam. And, when I was thinking about this and thinking about any extra information I wanted to share, I think first it's get creative with your monetization. Just because this is how I monetize and my price points and how I do my mastermind, that's great. It works for me. Figure out what works for you and your audience. There are so many different ways to do it. And you're the only one who understands how your podcast fits into your lifestyle, into your business, into however and why ever you started it. So get creative and do something that's fun and feels good to you, because podcasting is fun, but it's even more fun when you make money doing it. So
love that.
Get creative with that. And then I think my final piece of advice is make your podcast easy to share. When I look at episodes that are streamed or downloaded faster than other ones, sure, sometimes it's topic related, but a lot of times it's related to my guest sharing the episode. So when I started emailing them with a copy of the cover art and a link to share, it made it a lot easier for them to share, and they would share it more. And that in turn helps your own download rates, etc., grow your subscribers. And so those are always kind of my final tips for people.
So I'm going to give you some really good artwork, Shaye, and quote cards, and what are the teasers? And so you're going to have everything you can to share with your listener.
You can
awesome.
Tag me as a collab partner, whatever you want.
Awesome.
Happy to share.
183 episodes. You've learned a lot. You've been in front of 250,000 downloads already. And congrats to your success. To the listener, The next episode's going to be full of value. I will see you there.
You know, I really don't say this nearly enough. I don't mention this, and I feel horrible because it's a great resource for you to be able to take your podcast to the next level. And it's simply a free resource that I don't need your email or anything. It's just a podcasting course that I created that is ended up putting in the very first 6 episodes of this podcast. So if you haven't checked it out, definitely going to want to just check out those first 6 episodes, see how they can help you improve your podcast, get in front of more people, and have a better result where you're making more money through the podcast, etc. So much can happen after you listen through episodes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So if you haven't done it, go do it now. And by the way, if you're subscribed, you'll keep hearing more great content. So to those of you who are, I'll see you on the next episode.